Okay, is that looking all right?
Yep, looking good.
All right, well, afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here to talk today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my work using VR as a training tool. I was really interested to see Tom's session yesterday where he talked about the kind of relative uses of VR as an experimental tool for studying autism, and also as a medium for interventions and kind of practical applications. So I'm going to very much talk about the latter. I won't specifically talk about autism, but hopefully some of the kind of principles and ideas that I'll talk about in terms of other applications of VR training will be kind of relevant. So my background is kind of in sort of skill acquisition research. So I'm interested in how people learn new skills and then how they can apply them, typically in kind of stressful, time-constrained dynamic environments like sport, the military, surgery, and some kind of safety critical industries. So this work has kind of gravitated towards using VR as a training tool in those areas. So particularly in areas like nuclear safety, oil and gas, in sporting environments, and I guess probably most of my work is around defense and policing. So in these areas, we're generally kind of using VR as a tool for training more sort of cognitive and perceptual skills, but I'll sort of talk about the relative kind of strengths and weaknesses for some different kind of skill learning in a little bit. Okay, so why might VR be a kind of optimal sort of training tool? There's some kind of general benefits or potential benefits of virtual reality, kind of as I see it. So there's things like it's quite engaging. There's that obvious effect when someone puts on a VR headset and says, wow, isn't this cool? Which obviously is not enough to make it an effective tool, but actually that's quite a nice kind of initial step for getting people to buy into using it. It's often cheaper. So if you're comparing virtual reality to other kind of training situations, and you've got physical practice equipment, it can be a lot cheaper. So my kind of example on the right is this is a nuclear reactor simulation that I've been involved with, but equally just something like in the previous talk where practicing with a coffee machine, you might not have the coffee machine to practice with, and a simple simulation in the VR headset might actually be cheaper than having extra coffee machines to train with. This kind of training can be delivered remotely. It means people don't have to go to the physical thing to practice. The training can kind of come to them. Similarly, it can often be safer. So again, in the kind of applications to industry or military, even things like surgery, people can practice on a virtual person rather than a real person. And I've kind of used a cheesy line that it makes the impossible possible, but it does kind of enable different applications of training that we otherwise couldn't do. But I'd say my sort of particular interest in VR as a training tool is around the sort of pedagogical opportunities it gives us. So, for example, as someone who's interested in kind of skill learning and motor learning, we know how important repetition is when we're trying to learn any kind of skill. And often if you're training with physical equipment, it's kind of limited in its availability, and often people don't get the kind of number of repetitions they need to really learn skills to a high level. And VR is quite useful for this. You can have multiple headsets instead of just one piece of kit that trainees have to take it in turns on. In a similar vein, it kind of allows more variation. So if you've only got one physical thing to practice in, you only kind of learn a skill in one way. In VR, we can keep regenerating new scenarios. and it can be an almost endless supply of training variation. VR also allows more sort of active and exploratory kind of learning, so you can have a go, get it wrong, and kind of learn through trial and error a little bit. As a researcher as well, the kind of enhanced measurement of it is quite exciting, and for training, it means we can hopefully gather more kind of information about how learners are behaving in a virtual environment, and hopefully that allows us to monitor when learning is happening and improve training in that way. Similarly, it allows some kind of automated feedback. So it might be that you're trying to train a skill and it depends on having a coach there to teach the learner, but actually with a VR environment, it might be that we can automate some of that process of people getting feedback on what they're doing, and they can be training on their own without having someone there to supervise them. Another kind of interesting application is the way we can use VR to kind of optimize training for individuals. So a kind of pretty kind of pervasive issue in loads of education and training settings is that learners get the same kind of curriculum and it's not optimized to their individual needs. As virtual reality sort of works a bit like a computer game, in which, you know, a computer game adapts to how good the player is, we can develop VR environments that hopefully can adapt to either the performance or the particular behaviors of individual learners. And this might kind of relate a little bit to the point someone made earlier about adapting VR to autistic individuals who might have particular kind of learning needs. So for balance, some of the ways in which VR might not be a good training tool, or instances in which it might not be useful. So VR's often, as I'm sure you can imagine, is quite often adopted just because it's kind of new and shiny. And in general, it's often adopted without any kind of really good evidence base for its effectiveness. Unfortunately, I think this is probably a problem we're always going to have, because the rate at which this technology is developing is much faster than the rate at which we can produce any kind of good empirical evidence for whether it's effective for training. But perhaps a little bit more interestingly, and perhaps particularly relevant for today, is some of the kind of perceptual challenges that VR may pose. So one of the classic ones is the kind of vergence accommodation issues we get in virtual reality. So while people are behaving as though they're acting in a 3D world, we're actually tricking their optical system about the kind of depth of the things they're interacting with. So for any kind of visually guided skills, this does raise some questions about whether the sorts of ways we behave in the virtual world are actually going to then transfer to the real world, if actually our kind of visuomotor system is behaving in a slightly different way in the virtual world. Related to that is the kind of lack of haptics in virtual reality. Some of the new technologies providing haptic information in VR are like pretty incredible, but actually still such a long way away from truly realistic haptic information. So any tasks in which we're attempting to teach some kind of motor abilities, we know that the kind of haptic feedback you get when you're learning is very important for how you develop those motor skills. So there's definitely some questions there around whether the lack of haptic information is going to impair the kinds of things we can learn in virtual reality. And a slightly more kind of conceptual idea is whether some of these perceptual problems might actually bias us towards slightly different modes of control. So the sort of uncertainty around some of the perceptual information might bias us towards more kind of deliberate conscious control. But that's sort of to be investigated, I think. But any of the, I guess the take-home message from that is that any of those things, if they're altering the way in which we behave in VR, that might cause problems later when we try and take the things we've learned in a virtual world and apply them to the real world. Because if the two things don't quite match up, the sort of transfer might not work. Okay, so given that there's some really exciting opportunities for using VR, but also possibly some challenges, I think it's really important to be able to think through the ways in which we can make sure that VR training is going to be effective. One of which is selecting it for the right kinds of tasks. So we know that kind of the real world is almost always going to be better. And if we can do the thing in the real world, that's probably our best bet for training. This means that for us to use VR as a training tool, we need a really clear rationale for why we're doing it. So that rationale might be that we can't physically do that thing. It might be that actually VR allows us to do training in a new way. It might be that we can support learners with extra feedback. It might be that it makes what would be a really stressful environment a lot more easy to deal with, so that you can sort of learn some initial skills in a simple VR environment before you then have to go and apply them to doing some more real world training. Next up, kind of designing the VR tool appropriately. So this is VR design that's focused on your training goal, not VR design that's focused on looking fancy and looking cool. And this relates to the idea of fidelity, which I'll come to in a minute. And then a slightly kind of fuzzier one, but just worth mentioning, I think, is the way in which VR is implemented in the wider kind of learning space. So it might be that VR is one part of a curriculum, and we need to apply it in the right way in relation to the other things people might be doing. So it might be the only kind of training someone's getting for a particular skill. It might be an add-on to some physical training. And also thinking about the characteristics of the learners. So particularly for current purposes, we need to have an understanding of not just, is this a good VR tool for training this particular skill, but actually, is this a good tool for these learners to learn this skill? Okay, so I just wanted to talk very briefly about the idea of VR fidelity. So fidelity is often used in relation to VR. People say, oh, this is a really high fidelity simulation. And generally what they mean when they say high fidelity is that it looks real, it's really highly detailed, and it kind of looks kind of cool and impressive. But for training purposes, I think it's kind of useful to break it down into some other kind of levels. Some of these ones that I've shown up here are from a table in a paper that we wrote where we designed a framework for kind of testing and validating VR environments. This is not to say that this is like an exhaustive kind of list of different ways in which you could characterize fidelity, but these were some of the main types that we identified that might be useful for thinking about when you're designing a VR training tool. So we described physical fidelity as essentially what's typically meant by fidelity, which is the high degree of like visual realism. We also identified psychological fidelity, which is how well a simulation represents the kind of perceptual and cognitive features of the actual task. So for example, if you were creating a driving simulator, ideally your driving simulator would induce the same kind of level of mental effort as real driving. It would induce people to kind of look in the same areas. So do they look at the same areas of the road? Do they check their mirrors in the same ways? So people are people using their sort of cognitive and perceptual abilities in a similar way in the VR world to the real world. A couple of the other types we identified were sort of affective or emotional fidelity. So if your real task is quite stress inducing and quite anxiety provoking, in order to have high sort of emotional fidelity, you would require your VR environment to produce those same kinds of feelings of stress or anxiety. And also kind of ergonomic or biomechanical fidelity refers to whether the VR simulation creates realistic motor movements. So if anyone's ever played like Wii tennis on Nintendo Wii, you probably found that that tennis game doesn't induce you to swing your arm like you would swing a real tennis racket. You pretty quickly work out that if you just hold the control and kind of flick it, you can perform the task really well. So that's pretty poor kind of ergonomic fidelity, which would suggest that learning to play tennis on the Wii is not going to help you play tennis in the real world. So I guess my point here is really that we don't necessarily need to tick all these boxes, but actually we need to be aware of which ones are important for our current purposes. So if I am trying to train a tennis swing, it might be that getting the kind of biomechanical or ergonomic fidelity of the simulation is really important. But other features, maybe the physical fidelity, are not going to be as important for kind of still achieving some useful training. So applying VR to the right tasks, this is kind of a tricky one, and one that I've thought quite a lot about. I've quickly designed this little graphic, and I would really say don't read too much into it. This is more just to illustrate that idea that some skills are going to be harder to train in VR, some are going to be easier. So in particular, things like fine motor skills, it's quite likely that these are going to be quite challenging to train in virtual reality, as I kind of alluded to earlier, in terms of the difficulties with producing good haptic feedback. So this, I guess I'm not saying fine motor abilities can't be trained in virtual reality. It's more a case that it's going to be challenging and it's going to require higher levels of fidelity. And those are obviously expensive and difficult to achieve. If we kind of shift to the other end, more kind of procedural skills are typically quite kind of applicable to VR training. So if we take the kind of driving example again, it might be that actually controlling the wheel in VR is not going to transfer to the real world very well. It's quite difficult to match the two things together. So that kind of motor skill is difficult. But actually, if what you're trying to train is things like learning to check your mirrors before you indicate and then turn the vehicle, that actually probably have got a lot better chance at successfully training those sort of procedural skills. So as I say, don't kind of take this figure as anything that's especially well kind of developed, but it's sort of my way of thinking about how some skills might require quite high levels of fidelity and therefore be harder to train in VR, whereas others might be a little bit easier to achieve and not require such advanced sort of technologies. Okay. So I thought I'd just flash up a couple of instances and when we've tried to test and validate VR environments for training. So I guess you can be in the situation in which you're thinking, I need to design a VR environment to train task X, or actually you might already have one and want to decide, is this going to be any good? So a couple of the kind of typical ways in which people will test an existing environment is to look at novice expert differences. So if we have a VR environment that's kind of quite representative of the real skill, we would expect that people who have expertise in the real thing should also be experts in the virtual task. So that kind of difference you would observe between a novice and an expert in the real world should be maintained if our VR environment's any good. On the right was some work we did to test this VR football simulator. So this is a kind of training tool where you can practice passing and heading and things in virtual reality. And we got some different levels of football players, novice players, academy level players, and professional players, and kind of looked at all the different metrics in the VR simulation to see whether it was sensitive to those kind of pre-existing differences. We've done similar work with golf simulators. So if you look at the figures on the top, you can see that we got some really high level golfers and some total novice golfers, and we compared their performances between real world and virtual world. You can see here that the kind of novice expert differences were maintained quite well, which is a kind of a tick in the box to say that the virtual environment was reasonably representative of the real thing, and those kind of skill level differences were maintained. You can see, however, that the kind of performance levels were generally worse. So these elite players in the real world, their putting accuracy was quite clearly better than it was in the virtual world, and the same for the novices. So kind of a tick in one sense and a question mark in another, in that that difference is maintained, but actually the kind of calibration between the two is maybe not quite right. Another approach is to just compare different kind of behavioral metrics between a virtual environment and the real one. So these might be like motor movements, or these might be kind of eye movements, measures of cognitive abilities. So for example, in this golf one, if you look at the plots on the bottom, you can see we compared people's perceptions of distance. So in the real world, the kind of dotted black line shows the real distance that people were from the hole. And so experts were pretty good at guessing how far away they were, and novices sort of underestimated. Then when we looked at it in virtual reality, again, experts were pretty, or on average, were pretty good, and novices, again, underestimated. You can see there's a little bit more variation in the virtual world. So these kind of comparisons are quite useful to get a sense of whether your VR environment is recreating what you want it to recreate. Similarly, we can use self-reports of things like presence. So to what extent do people feel they truly existed in the VR environment? Things like workload, and also tests of sort of face validity. So this is when you simply just ask people to report, do you think this is realistic? Do you think this is going to be an effective training tool? And it's quite simple, but in things like the aviation industry, where they have some really highly developed flight simulators, this is their main kind of way of validating their simulations. So you'll get really experienced pilot who knows one particular plane really well. They'll come in, they'll use the flight simulator, and they'll provide loads of ratings about whether the controls and things are a good representation of the real plane. Okay, so something someone actually alluded to earlier was this idea of transfer. So we've got all these kind of different ways we've used for testing and exploring whether VR environments are any good, but ultimately it comes down to whether what you learn in VR transfers to the real world. Obviously, this needs good empirical data, which, as we know, is time consuming and costly. So actually, people will often kind of adopt VR training tools without doing that, and kind of understandably, in the sense that the amount of time and effort you might put into testing and collecting data on a VR tool, you could have just used it and seen if it worked anyway. So actually, this kind of way in which we're often trying to play catch up in terms of testing VR applications is kind of a constant challenge. And I think some of the ideas I presented on the last couple of slides for different ways to validate things like the psychological fidelity or the kind of biomechanical fidelity of VR environments might be quite important for kind of validating or testing a VR tool without having to conduct, a big randomized controlled trial to determine whether it provides any or leads to kind of real world transfer. So I guess I would describe those as a little bit of a shortcut, but actually a really sort of useful shortcut. And actually, if we're trying to develop tools for industry, for sport, for clinical populations, for healthcare, that there are actually some good steps in the right direction when we can't do perhaps the sort of randomized controlled trials we would like to test them. Okay, that is me done really. So thanks very much, and happy to do any questions.
Thank you very much for that very interesting and insightful talk, David. Really enjoyed that. Does anybody have any questions at all for David?
Apologies if I went over a little bit.
Oh, there's a question for you, David. It says, you mentioned that you can potentially individualize training according to a person's specific needs or characteristics. This would be pretty cool from an autism research perspective, as the autistic community often have very different abilities and living difficulties. Could you give an example of how this could be done, or how you may have done this before?
Yeah, so we've only done this in relatively simple ways so far. So what we've tried to do is do the simple kind of performance, kind of, we maybe call it like self-adaptive. So the VR environment is programmed in a way that it's able to recognize what your performance level is and then adapt the training difficulty to match that kind of level. So we know that kind of optimizing the level of challenge for learners there's a kind of a sweet spot where they learn the best. We've also started exploring some ways of using like eye movement recordings to adapt the VR environment to learners. So in addition to that kind of performance element, matching it to their performance, also matching it to things like their anxiety. So if we can use eye movements as a way to index that someone is really anxious or stressed, or perhaps on the other hand, maybe they're just bored and they're sort of understimulated, whether we can then adapt the VR environment to become more challenging, or we might need to adapt it to become more relaxing. So it could be that people are sort of overstimulated, and we can adapt it in that way. So yeah, I don't have sort of super developed ways of doing this as yet, but something I'm think's kind of an exciting way in which we could use virtual reality.
Okay, thank you, David. Another question is asking, Irene Valerie is asking, your opinion about the link between how vision is affected by VR and what people with ASD rely on vision. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. I might not know enough about the about autism to give a really good answer to this. But the visual stuff I'm aware of is how we're sort of tracking our perceptual system into thinking we're acting in 3 dimensions. And if we're then performing like visually guided tasks like, I don't know, throwing or catching or reaching for things, that actually our movements might be kind of miscalibrated from our vision. I don't know, I'm not sure if I'm really answering the question there, but.
Okay, I have a question. This is related to like previous work I've done in terms of performance. So one of my colleagues compared basketball in real life to basketball in a video game, the Wii, and he actually found similar to what you're reporting. I was just wondering how whether your research adapted the skill level to the experts that you were looking at, how that worked, or whether that was done.
So did we adapt, like, so for example, in the golf, did we adapt the golf
Yes,
task
yes.
to their, we didn't really, we just used a fairly simple golf task where kind of the novices and the experts would be able to kind of perform it. So it's quite simple, just sort of putting.
Okay.
With that same golf task, we did do a very simple kind of training study, and we found that slightly surprising to us, actually, it was quite effective for some initial training for sort of novice golfers. So we compared people who trained in a virtual world and people who trained in the real world, and actually their kind of initial learning was pretty equivalent. So I think what would happen is if you kept doing this, the real world would end up being better than people in the virtual world. This is in terms of then transferring to the real world again. But I think it highlights that maybe there's an application of VR, even for these things where we think, oh, VR might not be perfect for this. It may be applicable in like early stages. So if you're just learning the basics of something, VR may not be optimal, but actually it might be good enough for those sort of early stages in skills.
Okay, so we're running a little bit behind, but I can do one more question. Sharona says, relating to the vision, I wonder if David has any thoughts on the topic of stereo vision, if it could be improved by using VR. There are some suggestions that might be helpful, but how much would that be just practice effect, especially as VR has some issues regarding adjusting for good stereo vision?
Yeah, yeah, I've seen those. There are like vision training uses of VR that rely on that like decoupling of your like convergence, I think. Sorry, let me do the question again.
Sorry, I
yeah.
can just no,
Sorry.
it's just sorry. It's just because there's some literature, I know I've done a little literature review on that. So I just wondered, because I remember seeing the divergence conflict, you had a picture of it. So I just thought maybe it's just some sort of you had some ideas around it, that's all. It is just to sort of see, because there is an issue with the headset itself with making stereo vision good enough, especially because only some headsets have an adjustment for the interocular distance and some don't. So I just want for general thoughts where nothing's so overly expert, but just
yeah. My sort of understanding is that the technology is improving quite a bit, so that actually those divergence accommodation conflict issues are obviously you can never get rid of it because it's the screen's still on your face, but they're getting quite good, and also I think they're probably minor issues. So when you are providing, as you say, providing you've got the interocular distance correct, I think they're probably quite minor issues, and perhaps more the sort of thing that researchers are interested in, that this is a really interesting kind of weird perceptual effect. And actually for the vast majority of sort of applications of VR, I think it's probably not too big of an issue. Like I say, providing you get the adjustments right for each person.
Tobias says, thank you for the great talk. You mentioned that an advantage of VR is that it's cheaper. I guess this will depend on the number of the people you will train and the actual task you train. Do you have any ideas when it actually becomes cheaper? Have you seen any studies that have looked at it, cost benefits of VR training?
Yeah, there was a huge, not huge, but a big like commercial study I saw recently where they'd created some VR training and basically plotted like how many people they'd managed to train, and but actually over time, if you use it for enough people, it then becomes cheaper. I think it's cheaper in the sense of tasks that are then hard to train in the real world. So some of the applications I mentioned, like nuclear reactors and things, like you can't go and build a nuclear reactor for the same money that you could build a VR simulation. So I guess it's on a case by case basis, and as you say, it's the more times you use it, the more sort of cost efficient it becomes. And also the way that the technology is progressing, like the headsets are now pretty accessible, and those kind of costs are always going to be improving, I think.
Okay, so thank you very much, David.